Late at night, two white police officers cruise through an upscale neighborhood, their patrol car rolling slow over the smooth pavement. Their eyes scan the empty streets, looking for anything out of place, anything that doesn't belong. One officer sips his coffee bored until his partner nudges him, jerking his chin toward a man standing alone beside a sleek black luxury car. The man is tall, well dressed, his suit crisp and tailored, his posture calm but focused. As he reaches into his pocket, the first officer leans forward, narrowing his eyes. He looks out of place, don't you think? The second officer nods, shifting in his seat. Yeah, something's off, he mutters, then flips on the lights, bathing the street in red and blue. They pull up slowly, stopping just behind the car. Both officers step out, hands on their holsters. As they approach, the man turns to face them, his expression unreadable, his face illuminated by the flashing lights. Sir, one officer calls out in a firm, practiced tone, "What are you doing here at this hour?" The man sighs, barely concealing his frustration. "Unlocking my car, officer. Now if you don't mind." He reaches for the door handle, but the first officer steps closer, blocking his path. His gaze flickers toward the car's emblem, a top-tier model, expensive, rare, the kind of car that costs more than his yearly salary. "This your car, sir?" The officer presses, his voice thick with doubt. The man exhales sharply. "Yes," he says slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "I just said that. Now if you'll excuse me, I'd like to go home." "Not so fast," the second officer interrupts. "Let's see some ID." The man stills, his jaw tightening for a fraction of a second before he moves again, reaching into his jacket, calm, slow. But the officers tense up, their hands twitching over their holsters. The first one barks out, "Hands where I can see them, sir." The man freezes, staring at them, his expression shifting from frustration to something sharper, something colder. "Are you serious?" he asks, his voice even measured. "I said hands up now," the officer repeats, his voice edged with something close to excitement, like he's been waiting for this moment. "This is ridiculous," the man mutters, shaking his head. He never gets to finish. The second officer grabs his arm, jerks him around, shoving him hard against the car. The man grunts at the impact, his palms playing flat against the cool metal cuffs, flicking around his wrists before he can even process what's happening. "You have the right to remain silent," the first officer says, grinning just slightly as they pat him down. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The man's head drops forward, his fingers curling into fists against the car's surface. "This is a mistake. You don't know what you're doing." The officers exchange a glance, smug, sure of themselves. "We know exactly what we're doing," the first officer chuckles as he pushes the man toward the squad car. "Neighborhood like this car, like that guy like you, doesn't add up. We'll get it all sorted downtown." The man says nothing, just stares straight ahead, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared, even with his hands cuffed behind his back. He carries himself like someone used to authority, used to command. But the officers don't notice, don't care. They shove him into the back seat, slam the door shut. One of them chuckles under his breath, "Another good bust." As they pull away, the car's owner watches from a second-story window, hidden behind curtains, his mouth slightly open, his phone in hand, recording everything. At the station, the sergeant barely glances up from his paperwork as the two officers drag the man inside. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the dull gray walls, the air thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee and sweat. One officer tugs the man forward, pushing him toward the booking desk, but the other drops a hastily scribbled report onto the counter. "Trespassing, resisting arrest. Looks like we got ourselves a car thief," the officer says with a smirk. The sergeant raises an eyebrow, finally looking up from his files. "This guy stole a car, huh?" The first officer nods, arms crossed, smug, like he just won a prize. "Caught him lurking around a luxury sedan in Westbridge. Guy had an attitude, refused to show ID, had to take him in before he could bolt." The man straightens his suit as much as his cuffed wrists allow, lifting his chin slightly, his expression unreadable, but his voice smooth, calm, controlled. "I told you before, officers, I own that car. You never even gave me a chance to prove it." He turns to the sergeant, his dark eyes locking onto him, unwavering. "I'd like to call my attorney now." The sergeant exhales, rubbing his temple, like he's already tired of this conversation. Lot of confidence for a guy in cuffs. He mutters, then waves at one of the deputies. "Take his prints." Let's see who we're dealing with. The officer grabs the man's wrists, pressing his fingers down onto the scanner. The machine beeps, processing his information. A second later, the screen flashes red, displaying a message that makes the surgeon's forehead crease. Restricted access clearance required. He leans closer, muttering under his breath, "What the hell?" The two officers shift their weight, exchanging a quick glance, confusion flickering across their faces. "Just run it again," one of them says, "probably a glitch." But the second attempt results in the same message. The surgeon's expression darkens. He reaches for the phone, dialing a number with quick, precise movements, a few words spoken low and urgent. Then silence. The man watches, calm, patient, like he's seen this play out before. Minutes later, the front doors of the station burst open. A team of well-dressed men and women storm inside, their shoes clicking sharply against the tiled floor, their presence commanding, their eyes sharp and focused. The man in front adjusts his cufflinks, his voice like steel when he speaks. "Release him now." The surgeon sits up straighter. "Who the hell are you?" The late attorney doesn't even blink. "My name is James Whittaker, and this man you've arrested is not just an innocent civilian." He leans in, slightly lowering his voice, but making sure everyone in the room hears him. "He is a federal judge, and you've just made the biggest mistake of your careers." The station goes silent. The two officers go rigid, the smirks wiped clean from their faces. One of them opens his mouth, then closes it again, his Adam's apple bobbing. The surgeon's gaze snaps back to the man in cuffs, his mind racing. "Judge Elijah Carter." The name suddenly clicks. The reputation, the cases, the high-profile rulings against police misconduct. The surgeon swallows hard, standing slowly. "Undo those cuffs now." The officer fumbles with the key, metal scraping against metal. As the cuffs click open, Judge Carter rolls his shoulders, adjusting his sleeves before rubbing his wrists where red marks are already forming. His face remains impassive, unreadable, but there is something in his eyes, something unreadable, something dangerous. The late attorney steps forward, his voice like a blade cutting through the heavy silence. "You will be hearing from us," he says, turning sharply, gesturing for the judge to follow. The officers stand frozen as Judge Carter strides past them without another word, his posture steady, his presence undeniable. The station doors close behind him, leaving the two officers standing there, pale, wide-eyed, realizing in real time just how deep the hole they've just dug really is. The courtroom is packed, every seat filled with reporters, legal analysts, and spectators whispering among themselves, the air charged with curiosity, tension. The officers sit stiffly at the defense table, their once confident demeanor replaced with nervous glances at each other. Judge Elijah Carter enters the room, his presence commanding, wearing a dark suit that fits him like armor. His expression is calm, unreadable, but his eyes hold something sharp, something unshakable. The bailiff calls the court to order. All rise. The room falls silent as the judge takes his seat, his gavel taps once echoing through the chamber. "You may be seated." Everyone obeys, except for the defense attorney, who stands adjusting his tie, shifting his weight before clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my clients maintain they acted within the scope of their duty. They observed what appeared to be suspicious activity in a high-value neighborhood and acted accordingly." The officers straighten slightly, chins lifted, hands folded tightly, as if holding onto some last shred of control. Across the room, the prosecution's late attorney steps forward, walking with measured confidence, acting accordingly. She repeats, her voice laced with disbelief. "Your Honor, what these officers did was not just an error in judgment, it was a blatant act of racial profiling and an abuse of power." The defense attorney scoffs. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a simple misunderstanding. The officers had no way of knowing who the defendant was at the time. They were just doing their jobs." The prosecution's lips press into a thin line before she gestures toward the screen in the courtroom. "Let's see exactly what their job looked like that night, shall we?" A remote clicks. A video begins playing, security footage from a nearby business. The crowd leans in, watching as Judge Carter is seen standing calmly beside his car, hands in his pockets, not acting suspicious, not breaking into anything, just existing. Then the police cruiser pulls up, lights flashing. Two officers step out, their body language immediately aggressive. The courtroom watches as the officers interrogate him, cut him off, refuse to let him show identification before slamming him against the car, cuffing him without cause. Murmurs ripple through the audience, some shaking their heads, some whispering, "This is unbelievable." The officers shift in their seats, their faces tight. The defense attorney clears his throat, clearly unsettled. "This doesn't prove intent, Your Honor. These officers made a judgment call." The prosecution doesn't even flinch. "Judgment call." She clicks another button on the remote, playing the officer's body cam footage. The audio fills the room. "Listen carefully, Your Honor." The first officer's voice crackles through the speakers. "We got ourselves a car thief." The second officer chuckles. "No way, this dude owns this ride, bet you anything." Gasps echo across the courtroom. The defense attorney's face drains of color. The officers sit frozen, jaws clenched, knowing there's no way to spin this. Judge Carter watches his own wrongful arrest play out on screen. His expression never changes, but his grip on the edge of the table tightens just slightly, his knuckles going white. The prosecutor pauses the video, turning toward the jury members, who are already staring at the officers with thinly veiled disgust. This is what they thought of him before they even spoke to him. This is how they see people who look like him. The law is meant to protect and serve, but who does it serve when those enforcing it make assumptions instead of following the facts? Silence stretches heavy, suffocating. The judge finally leans forward, hands clasped together, his voice low, firm, yet carrying through the room. "You gentlemen filed reports stating that I was resisting arrest, trespassing, that I refused to comply with lawful orders. Is that correct?" The officers don't answer at first. The second officer swallows hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Carter's gaze never wavers, his next words like a blade cutting through the lies. "And yet here we see the truth. Before us the reports were false, which means you lied under oath, which means you perjured yourselves. And if you can lie so easily about me, one has to wonder how many others have suffered at your hands without the privilege of a camera capturing the truth." The jury members exchange glances, their decision already forming before deliberation even begins. The courtroom buzzes with quiet but undeniable outrage. The officers who once thought they were in control now sit trapped, knowing the weight of the truth is about to crash down on them harder than they ever expected. The courtroom remains silent, every eye fixed on the two officers who now sit stiffly in their seats, hands clasped, knuckles white, their faces pale as Judge Carter's words settle over them like a heavy weight. The jury watches their every move, some shaking their heads, some glancing at one another with barely concealed disbelief. The prosecutor steps forward, slowly, measured, composed, but her eyes burn with intensity. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to enter into evidence the official arrest report filed by these officers." She holds up a document, waving it slightly for the jury to see. It states that Judge Carter refused to provide identification, that he was acting erratically, and posed a potential threat. She walks toward the jury, pausing to let her words sink in. "But we have just seen undeniable proof that every single statement in this report was a lie." She lets the silence stretch thick and heavy before continuing. "These officers assumed Judge Carter was a criminal before he even had a chance to speak. They wrote a report filled with fabricated details to justify their actions, and they did so because they believed no one would question them, no one would challenge their word over theirs, because for too long law enforcement has operated under the assumption that their badge grants them immunity from consequences." The defense attorney shifts, uncomfortably tugging at his collar. "Your Honor, while the footage may be concerning, we cannot ignore the fact that police work is often fast-paced and unpredictable. Officers make split-second decisions in the field, and in this case they misjudged the situation, but there was no malice involved." Judge Carter tilts his head just slightly, his dark eyes locked onto the defense attorney. "Misjudged the situation," he repeats, his voice even, smooth, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Tell me, counsel, if I had been a white man standing beside that car, wearing this same suit in this same neighborhood, do you believe for a second that those officers would have even stopped?" The defense attorney hesitates, his mouth opening, then closing. No words come out. Judge Carter leans forward, resting his elbows on the bench, lacing his fingers together. "That's what I thought." The prosecution turns to the screen, once more flicking the remote. Another video plays, this time highlighting the history of these two officers. multiple complaints filed against them for excessive force, wrongful arrests, and racial profiling. The defense attorney's face grows red, sweat forming at his temples. The officers shift uncomfortably, their jaws tightening, their careers unraveling before their eyes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution says firmly, this is not a case of two officers making a simple mistake. This is a case of systemic abuse of power, a case of individuals who have used their authority to target people who look like Judge Carter because they know they can get away with it. She gestures toward the judge sitting before them, only this time they chose the wrong person. One of the officers suddenly stands, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. We were just doing our jobs. His voice shakes slightly, but he forces himself to glare at the prosecution. This whole case is being blown out of proportion. The prosecutor doesn't even blink. Doing your job, she echoes. Tell me, officer, when exactly does your job include fabricating reports, violating civil rights, and abusing your power? When does your job include throwing an innocent man into the back of a squad car without a second thought? The officer's mouth snaps shut, his eyes darting to his partner, but there is no help there, just the same stunned realization that they have already lost. Judge Carter exhales, slowly shaking his head. I have spent my career overseeing cases of racial injustice, of police misconduct, of wrongful arrests. I have seen countless defendants sit in that very chair trying to explain themselves, trying to plead for fairness, and I have ruled based on evidence, based on the truth. But I never imagined that one day I would be the one fighting to prove my innocence. He pauses, letting the weight of his words settle, and yet here I am. The jury looks at him with something close to awe. The courtroom hums with quiet tension. The officers no longer look smug, no longer look in control. They look like what they are, men who made a choice and now must face the consequences of that choice. The courtroom is silent, the weight of Judge Carter's words hanging over everyone like a heavy storm cloud. The officers sit motionless, their faces tight, their hands clenched as if gripping onto the last threads of their defense. But the damage is already done. The jury watches them with cold scrutiny. The spectators in the gallery murmur among themselves, a mixture of outrage and disbelief filling the space. The prosecutor steps forward again, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on the defense. Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to present additional footage evidence that further disproves the claims made by these officers. She raises the remote, clicking the screen to life again. This time the footage is from a different angle, a security camera from a store across the street. The video plays, showing the moment the officers arrived, Judge Carter standing calmly beside his car, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. There is no indication of erratic behavior, no threat, no reason for the officers to escalate. Then the audio crackles to life. The jury leans in, listening closely. The first officer's voice rings out low and casual, but with a sharp edge to it. Look at this guy standing here, like he owns the place. The second officer laughs back at the station. Let's see if his record is as clean as that suit. The footage pauses. The prosecutor turns to the jury, arms crossed across the room. Judge Carter remains still, unreadable, but his fingers tap against the table once, twice, then still. The prosecution clears her throat. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what was said before they even approached him. They assumed his guilt before he even spoke. They did not act in fear. They did not act out of necessity. They acted out of prejudice. The defense attorney shifts uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the table. But before he can speak, Judge Carter turns his gaze directly onto the officers, his voice even but firm. Tell me something, officers. When I stood beside my own car, what exactly made me a suspect? Was it my posture? Was it my demeanor? Was it the fact that I did not immediately cower at your approach? Neither officer answers. The second one swallows hard, looking at the table. The first clenches his jaw, staring straight ahead, refusing to meet the judge's eyes. The prosecution steps forward again. This is not an isolated incident. She continues, pulling another file from her briefcase. She lays it on the table, pushing it toward the jury. This file contains complaints filed against these officers in the last 3 years. She flips the pages one by one. Excessive force, wrongful arrests, intimidation tactics. Nearly all of these cases involve Black or Latino individuals. This is not coincidence, this is a pattern, and it is a pattern that stops today. One of the jury members exhales loudly, shaking their head. Murmurs ripple through the audience. The judge turns slightly, looking at the prosecutor, before nodding toward the defense counsel. Do you wish to cross-examine? The defense attorney clears his throat, adjusting his tie. Clearly rattled, Your Honor. The officers maintained that they were simply doing their jobs. Their intent was never to discriminate, but to ensure the safety of the community. And while this footage may paint a troubling picture, it does not prove deliberate misconduct. Police officers are put in difficult situations. Every day they must make snap decisions. George Carter tilts his head, his expression unreadable. A snap decision, he says slowly. So tell me, counselor, when they approached me, did they ever once ask for my identification before deciding I was a criminal? The defense attorney hesitates, the pause stretching too long before he exhales quietly. No, Your Honor. And when I attempted to provide it, was I given the chance to do so? Another beat of silence before the defense attorney shakes his head again. No, Your Honor. Judge Carter nods, leaning back slightly in his chair, his voice firm. Then explain to me how their actions could have possibly been about safety and not about assumptions, not about bias. The defense attorney has no answer. The jury watches the officers, who now look visibly shaken, their faces pale, their careers unraveling before their eyes, the weight of their choices pressing down on them harder than ever. The prosecutor steps forward one final time, her voice steady, her words a promise. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. The courtroom remains tense, the weight of the prosecution's final words settling over the room like a heavy fog. The officers sit stiff, backs straight, but their eyes betray them, shifting between the judge, the jury, and the growing number of spectators who now watch them with barely concealed contempt. The defense attorney clears his throat, his fingers gripping the table, his mind scrambling for something, anything to salvage what little ground they have left. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer Mitchell to the stand. The first officer hesitates for just a second before standing, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. As he steps toward the witness stand, he avoids Judge Carter's gaze, keeping his focus straight ahead. The bailiff approaches, swearing him in. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? The officer nods, his Adam's apple bobbing. I do. The defense attorney steps forward, his tone carefully measured. Officer Mitchell, can you describe for the court the events of that night from your perspective? The officer exhales, slowly rubbing his palms against his thighs before speaking. We were patrolling a high-value neighborhood when we noticed a man standing beside a luxury vehicle. It was late at night, and given the recent break-ins in the area, we had reason to believe the vehicle could have been at risk of theft. The prosecutor stands immediately. Objection, speculation. There is no evidence to suggest that break-ins had any relation to this case. Judge Carter nods, sustained. Officer Mitchell, stick to the facts of what occurred. The officer shifts slightly in his seat. Well, we approached the individual and asked what he was doing there. He responded with an attitude. He was dismissive and uncooperative. Given the circumstances, we believed it was necessary to detain him for further questioning. The prosecutor steps forward, her expression unreadable, her voice cool and unwavering. When you say attitude, Officer Mitchell, can you clarify? Did Judge Carter ever raise his voice at you? Did he make any threats? Did he physically resist in any way? The officer hesitates, lips parting before pressing together again. No, but. The prosecutor doesn't let him finish. And when he attempted to retrieve his identification, did you allow him the opportunity to do so? Another beat of silence before the officer sighs quietly. No, we did not. The jury watches intently, eyes narrowing. The second officer shifts uncomfortably in his seat, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The prosecutor takes a slow step closer, voice low but cutting. Tell me, Officer Mitchell, is it standard procedure to place a suspect in handcuffs before verifying their identity? The officer looks toward his partner just for a second before quickly correcting himself, shaking his head. No, not unless there is an immediate threat present. Was there an immediate threat present? The officer's jaw clenches, his fingers twitch before he exhales. No. Then why did you escalate the situation before ever confirming whether or not a crime had even been committed? The officer's gaze drops to the table. He doesn't answer. The prosecutor turns toward the jury. Her words deliberate. The officers in this case did not act out of fear. They did not act in the interest of safety. They acted on assumption that led them to arrest an innocent man without cause, assumption that led them to falsify an official report in an attempt to justify their actions. She steps closer to the jury box, her eyes locking on to each individual juror. If Judge Carter had been an average citizen, if there were no cameras, if there were no witnesses, what do you think would have happened that night? The jury shifts, some glancing down, some nodding ever so slightly, the weight of her words pressing into them. The spectators murmur, some whispering to each other, some shaking their heads, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Judge Carter watches Officer Mitchell, his face unreadable. Then he leans forward, voice calm but firm. Officer Mitchell, I will ask you one final question, and I suggest you answer carefully. If you had known that night who I was, if you had known my status as a federal judge, would you have treated me the same way? The officer doesn't answer at first, his throat working as he swallows hard. He opens his mouth, then closes it, then finally exhales, his shoulders slumping slightly. No, Your Honor. The courtroom is silent, the jury taking in every detail. The prosecutor steps back, satisfied, while the defense attorney looks pale, exhausted, knowing this case is slipping further and further from his grasp. Judge Carter leans back in his chair, pressing his fingers together before nodding, his voice steady. That will be all. The courtroom feels heavier now, the silence stretching thick and suffocating. The jury members exchange glances, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes sharp, taking in every word, every movement. The defense attorney rubs his temples, his mind scrambling for any way to regain control of the case. But there is no control left, no ground to stand on, no defense that can erase what has already been laid bare before them. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer Reynolds to the stand. His voice lacks confidence now, the usual smoothness replaced with something hesitant, something uncertain. The second officer's defense, before rising from his seat, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared as if bracing himself against an invisible force, he walks to the stand. The bailiff swears him in, and he nods, barely glancing at the judge, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles go white. Officer Reynolds, the defense attorney begins, voice carefully measured, can you walk us through the events of that night in your own words? The officer exhales through his nose, his gaze fixed on some invisible point ahead of him. We were patrolling the area. We saw a man standing next to a luxury car. He looked out of place given the neighborhood. We stopped to question him. He was uncooperative. We made the decision to detain him. The prosecutor stands immediately, objection vague and misleading. Uncooperative, how exactly? Judge Carter nods, sustained. Officer Reynolds, please clarify, what do you mean by uncooperative? The officer shifts slightly. He didn't answer our questions the way we expected him to. His tone was dismissive. The prosecutor steps forward, her voice sharp, dismissive, or simply unwilling to comply with an unlawful detainment. The officer hesitates, his mouth opening, then closing, his fingers twitching against his knee before he exhales slowly. We believed we were following protocol. The prosecutor's lips press together, then she moves closer, her eyes locking onto him with quiet intensity. Officer Reynolds, when you arrived on the scene, did you or your partner ever ask Judge Carter for identification before detaining him? No. Did you have any reason to believe he was in the process of committing a crime? No. Did he attempt to flee? Did he show any signs of aggression? Did he resist in any way before you placed him in cuffs? The officer's jaw clenches, his throat works as he swallows hard. Then finally he shakes his head. No. Then on what grounds did you decide to place him under arrest? The officer doesn't answer right away, his breathing shallow, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he exhales again, voice quieter this time. We thought he was a suspect. We made a mistake. The prosecutor doesn't move, doesn't blink, doesn't react immediately. Then after a long pause, she steps back just slightly, but her voice, when she speaks again, is razor sharp. You thought he was a suspect based on what? His clothing, his posture, the fact that he didn't immediately bow to your authority, or was it simply because of the color of his skin? A hush falls over the courtroom, so complete that even the sound of someone shifting in their seat feels deafening. Officer Reynolds swallows his Adam's apple bobbing, then he closes his eyes just briefly before opening them again, his voice barely above a whisper. We misjudged the situation. The prosecutor lets the silence stretch out, lets the words settle into the minds of the jury, into the bones of the courtroom, into the weight of history that lingers in spaces like these. Misjudged the situation, she repeats softly, then turns to face the jury members, her gaze sweeping over them. But that misjudgment led to a man being thrown against his own car, forced into the back of a squad car, humiliated, detained, treated like a criminal for no other reason than existing in a space these officers decided he did not belong in. She exhales, slowly turning back toward the stand. No further questions. Officer Reynolds remains seated, his hands still clasped tightly together, his eyes unfocused, as if he too realizes that the case is lost, that the truth, no matter how much they had hoped to bury it, has already been laid bare for all to see. The courtroom is thick with tension, every breath held, every movement careful, the weight of what has just been said still settling over the room. The jury sits rigid, their faces unreadable, but their eyes sharp, locked onto Officer Reynolds, who remains on the witness stand, his hands still clasped tightly together, his jaw clenched as if bracing for the final blow. The defense attorney shifts in his seat, glancing at his client, then at the jury, then finally at the judge. His fingers twitch as he stands, straightening his tie, clearing his throat. Officer Reynolds, the defense attorney, begins, his voice forced, steady. You stated that you and your partner made a mistake. Can you clarify what you mean by that? The officer exhales, slow and deliberate. He glances at his partner, then looks down at his hands, before finally lifting his gaze back toward the jury. We assumed he was a suspect. We acted on that assumption without confirming whether or not a crime had been committed. We escalated the situation before we had all the facts, and we falsified parts of the report to justify our actions. His voice is quieter now, as if even he cannot believe the words coming out of his own mouth. The defense attorney blinks, his lips pressed together tightly, before he glances at the jury, watching their reactions, but they remain still silent, absorbing every word. He exhales, looking back at his client. Officer Reynolds, do you believe that your actions that night were justified? A long silence stretches across the room before the officer shakes his head no. The murmurs in the courtroom grow louder, some gasps mixed in, others shaking their heads, whispering among themselves. The judge lifts a hand for silence, and the room obeys. The defense attorney shifts slightly, the tension evident in the way his shoulders tighten. You and Officer Mitchell have served for how many years? 12, the officer answers without hesitation. And in those 12 years, have you ever falsified reports before? The officer hesitates, his fingers tightening against his knee, his throat working before he finally exhales again, voice barely above a whisper, yes. The jury reacts immediately, some exchanging glances, some leaning back slightly, others with expressions so tight, so controlled that their judgment is already forming before deliberation even begins. The prosecutor does not move, her face unreadable, but the sharpness in her gaze does not waver. The defense attorney runs a hand down his face, his composure slipping, his frustration visible. He takes a step back, nodding slightly. No further questions. Judge Carter watches the officer for a long moment, then nods. Officer Reynolds, you may step down. The officer stands slowly, his movements mechanical, as he makes his way back to the defense table, his face pale. His partner refuses to look at him. The room remains silent until the prosecutor stands, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before she turns to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the evidence, we have seen the footage, we have listened to the officers themselves admit to their misconduct. But I ask you to consider this one question: if Judge Carter had not been who he is, if there were no cameras, if there were no witnesses, how many times do you think this has happened before? How many times have their false reports been believed? Without question, how many innocent men have been thrown into the system because of officers like these? The jury watches her, their eyes heavy with thoughts, some nodding subtly, some sitting a little straighter. The weight of responsibility pressing down on them. The prosecutor steps back, her voice unwavering when she speaks again. This case is not just about one wrongful arrest, it is about the abuse of power, the corruption of authority, and the lives that are damaged in its wake. She turns slowly, her eyes locking onto the two officers sitting at the defense table. They chose the wrong man that night, but how many others have suffered in silence? The courtroom is electric with emotion, some in the audience dabbing their eyes, others whispering angrily among themselves. The judge's gaze remains steady, his expression unreadable, as he watches the final moments of the trial unfold. The jury knows the truth. Now there is no spinning it, no denying it. The verdict is inevitable. The only thing left is to wait for the final words to seal their fate. The jury sits in tense silence, their eyes flickering between the judge, the prosecutor, and the two officers at the defense table, the weight of responsibility pressing down on them. Judge Carter watches them carefully, his expression unreadable, his fingers laced together as he waits for the final stage of a trial that should have never happened to him in the first place. The courtroom is packed, every seat filled, with people waiting with bated breath for what comes next. The defense attorney shifts in his chair, his face pale, his fingers drumming against the table. His career is on the line just as much as his client's, but there is nothing left to argue, no loophole, no justification that could undo what has already been laid bare. He glances toward Officer Mitchell and Officer Reynolds, both of whom sit rigid, staring at the polished wood of the defense table, as if willing it to swallow them whole. "Your Honor, the defense has nothing further," the attorney says, finally, his voice hollow, defeated. Judge Carter nods, turning his gaze toward the jury members, who sit unmoving, their expressions unreadable. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman with steel gray hair and piercing eyes, stands holding a sheet of paper in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom is so silent that even the soft rustling of paper as she unfolds it sounds deafening. People lean forward, anticipation thick in the air. Judge Carter nods, proceeding with the formalities. "On the charge of falsifying an official police report, how does the jury find the defendants?" "Guilty." "On the charge of unlawful detainment, how does the jury find the defendants?" "Guilty." "On the charge of official misconduct, how does the jury find the defendants?" "Guilty." A collective breath releases in the courtroom, but it is not relief, it is something heavier, something tinged with anger, sorrow, frustration. Some people whisper among themselves, some shake their heads, the officers close their eyes, their shoulders slumping as the weight of the verdict settles over them. Judge Carter nods, his face unreadable. "Very well, sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. This court is adjourned." The gavel strikes once, a sharp final sound that echoes through the courtroom, and just like that it is over. The officers remain seated, frozen as their world crumbles around them. The defense attorney mutters something to them, but they barely seem to register it. The prosecutor turns to pack her files, the weight of victory heavy but unsatisfying. There is no joy in proving something that should have never needed proving. She exhales softly, shaking her head, before glancing toward Judge Carter, who remains seated for just a moment, his gaze scanning the room, watching the people, watching the system, watching everything and nothing at once. As the courtroom empties, people murmur, some relieved, some still simmering with anger, some shaking their heads, as if they still cannot believe what they just witnessed. Judge Carter stands, finally adjusting his robe, before stepping down from the bench, his steps slow, controlled, but heavy with thought. As he reaches the door, someone calls out to him. He turns, an older black man dressed in a crisp suit approaches, extending a hand. "I just wanted to say I've been in this city for over 40 years, and I never thought I'd see a day like this." Judge Carter studies him for a moment, then takes his hand, shaking it firmly, a small nod of understanding passing between them, before the man steps away, disappearing into the crowd. Judge Carter exhales, stepping outside the courthouse, the evening air crisp against his skin. He watches as the officers are led out of the building, escorted toward waiting squad cars, their heads lowered, their faces pale. The system they once manipulated now swallowing them whole. He turns away, moving down the courthouse steps, his mind heavy, his heart heavier. He had won the case, he had proven the truth, he had forced accountability, but as he looked out over the city that night, he knew better than to think. that this was the end, this was just one battle in a war that had been waged for far too long.